So welcome everyone to Heading Towards an Unseeable Horizon, Diversifying Collections. I'm Lisa Swindell. I'm the Hood Museum of Art's inaugural Associate Curator of Photography. I organized this panel as part of my current exhibition, An Instant Out of Time, Shaping a Collection, and I'll be moderating today. We'll open the Q&A about 15 minutes before the end of the program, but please feel free to add questions in the Q&A section during the discussion, or when it's open to people speaking, just use the raise your hand feature so we can call on you. Before getting started with the conversation, I'd like to introduce the panelists. First is Janet Dees, the Stephen and Lisa Munster Tannenbaum, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Block Museum of Art, Northwestern University, where she is also affiliated faculty in the Department of Art History and an affiliate of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research in Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. Trained as an art historian of American art, her research and curatorial work focuses on the ways in which contemporary artists engage with history, archives, artist interest in transformational practices, and inclusive museum methodologies. Her work includes commitments to African American, African diasporan, and Native American and Indigenous artists. Prior to her appointment at the Block, Dees was curator at Site Santa Fe, where she worked since 2008. Dees is the recipient of a 2018 curatorial fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and was also a 2023 fellow at the Center of Curatorial Leadership. Next is Michael Hartman, who joined the Hood Museum of Art in 2021 as the Jonathan Little Cohen Associate Curator of American Art. He holds a BA from the University of Arkansas, an MA from Williams College, and is completing his PhD in art history at the University of Delaware, where his dissertation looks at the intersection of technology, artistic production, and the plantation in 18th century Maryland and Virginia. Michael's recent exhibitions include Liquidity, Art, Commodities, and Water, Historical Imaginary, and Gather, Move, Resonate, Nick Cave and Jeffrey Gibson, an exhibition co-curated with myself and Jamie Powell. His first book is a volume co-edited with Powell, tentatively titled Re-envisioning American Art, which will be published next year by the University of Washington Press. He has held positions at the Biggs Museum of American Art, the Clark Art Institute, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Dallas Museum of Art, and the Winther Museum. Next is Marina Taquino. I did it wrong, didn't I? Taquico? I'm still getting it wrong. I'm sorry. Could you please say it, Marina?
Marina Takenko.
Takenko. Sorry. There we go. Thank you. Marina Takenko is the inaugural Ellen McCulden Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She is a Jumoro Scholar who received her MA and PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and her BA from the University of Virginia. She has previously taught at Brown University and University of Pittsburgh. She has published articles in Feminist Studies, Panorama, Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, and Lateral, Journal of the Cultural Studies Association. Recent curatorial projects at the MFA include Marking Resilience, the Indigenous North American Prints, a temporary exhibition co-curated with MFA curator Edward Sewell, and artist Dwayne Slick, and A Little Bit of the Southwest, the first permanent gallery devoted to Native American art on the 20th century American floor. Her independent curatorial projects include James Taylor from An Untouched Landscape at the George Eastman Museum and the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Collection. Bendi Vora is an interdisciplinary photograph artist of Kenyan Indian heritage, associate lecturer at London College of Communication, and curator at Autograph, a London-based nonprofit arts charity that explores issues of identity, representation, human rights, and social justice through photography. She has curated a series of exhibitions, including Monica Alcazar Duarte, Digital Clouds Don't Carry Rain, Helen Emuzo, Voyages, Eric Gayamfi, Fixing Shadows, Julius and I, Palomi Basu, Fireflies, co-curated Ajamu, the patron saint of dark rooms, Sasha Huber, You Name It, Care 1, Contagion 1, Community, Self and Other, Lola Flash, Sir, Passing, and Maxine Walker, Untitled. contributing to a series of artist conversations with Miriam Waid, Sasha Uber, amongst others. Her writing has appeared in Zoom magazine, Another Country, British Documentary Photography since 1945, Foam magazine, and British Journal of Photography. She participates in public programs for Tate, Paul Mellon Center, the Photographers Gallery, amongst others. So I was inspired to put this panel together after reading parts of the 2022 Burns-Halprin report, specifically a quote by Naomi Beckwith, who's the deputy director at the Guggenheim, about a conversation she had with her husband while she was still at the MCA Chicago. So to paraphrase, she was saying that if a collection has thousands of works with a dominant group overly represented, and museums acquire about 25 works per year, it will take almost as long to reach parity as it took to develop the collection to date. And that's longer than any of our lifetimes. So thinking about that, what that then means for these efforts that many of us are trying to make, led to me wanting to gather this panel, especially with these particular people, to ask them, ways of how we can think about that in our strategies. So we're going to discuss the challenges, strategies, and hopes for collections that are more reflective of the breadth of global art making. So my first question to the group is, other than the head start some artists have in collections, what are some of the challenges to collecting with equity in mind? Oh, come on, this whole group's way chattier than that.
Okay. I'll start. I'll help you out there, Lisa. Just to say, so I'm Janet Dees. I'm at the Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University, which is an academic art museum, like the Hood. And I would say, rather than say a challenge, I think it's an opportunity that we have been leaning into. There are a couple of different pathways that works come into a collection. There's the purchases that we're initiating from the institution, but then there's also gifts of art, right? And I think one of the opportunities that we've been leaning into is to like work on the way in which we're messaging the kind of new direction and commitments in our collection toward diversity for that larger audience, so that donors and potential donors are kind of socialized to the kinds of work that we're wanting to add to the collection, so that those works that are coming in through gifts, which oftentimes may equal or surpass what we're able to initiate through purchase, are also aligned with like our strategic vision for the collection. So I think that is like one area of of kind of growth, and something that we saw as a challenge, but that we've been like working like to address very actively, and that's been it's been relatively successful so far. So that's just one thing.
I think what's different about, Autograph's collection in relation to Janet at Block and Hood Museum is that we are a collecting institution, but the works that predominantly form the collection were commissioned since, the founding of the organization. So I think our first artist commission with Joy Gregory was 1990/1991. And since then, it's like the collection has evolved through working with artists at various points in their careers, sometimes very early on. So I think we were the first institution to commission Yinka Shonibari to produce a photographic piece that's now in the collection. And it's kind of evolved since then. And there have been, I think, times that we've sought funding to address some of the gaps that we also have in the collection, where we know who's been missing in those narratives, for a long period of time in relation to, say, British documentary photography, and then have applied for funding specifically to pinpoint who those artists are and then address those gaps. So I guess that's the uniqueness of the collection, that it's very contemporary, it's very up to date, and it's always evolving.
So coming from, I'm Marina Takenko at the MFA in Boston, and coming from kind of a large, comprehensive museum, we have many different departments that kind of have individual collecting strategies. I don't want to get too ahead about my particular collection of Native American art. But I think one challenge that you have at such a large institution is understanding what equity means to begin with. So how are we defining equity? How are we seeing it across the museum? And, in any kind of large museum, there's not necessarily equity always built in based on which department you have, right? Prints and drawings are often much more reasonable than paintings. So the way that you're kind of building different areas of the collection, the parameters are quite different. But I think just in general, the challenge of kind of understanding what do we mean by equity, and if you're at a large institution, often equity is part of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. So there's also kind of other ideas that don't maybe particularly involve collecting per se, but are really kind of guiding the way that you're thinking about diversification overall. And I don't have like a perfect definition of equity, but I can say just for my own collection that um, representing the region that we're in is very important, and it's not something that we currently do with Native American art. So it's been a large collecting focus of mine that I can continue to talk about. But I think kind of being on the same page as an institution about, what we are trying to achieve when we are trying to achieve equity is a really large challenge.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Michael Hartman at the Hood Museum. Um, I think that one of the challenges, and I think everyone sort of alluded to this in some way, is the actual methods by which things come into the collection, both in the past and also in the present. So, it's important to be cultivating relationships with donors, I think, as Janet said, to help build gifts that align with your strategic plan. And I think, I don't know if Marina has felt this within kind of the MFA, because I haven't necessarily felt it here, but I've talked to other colleagues that sometimes it can be I don't know how to better say it, as a one and done mentality when adding works to the collection, right? So, you might add one painting by, let's say, Norman Lewis, who was a really major abstract artist in American art, but you might have 5 paintings, for instance, by someone like Robert Motherwell, right? And this idea that, you're bringing underrepresented or marginalized artists into the collection is really important. But does equity actually happen whenever you think about the number of works by the same artist that you're bringing into the collection versus what's already in the collection? So for instance, if the Hood Museum has about 15 prints by American artist Thomas Hart Benton, should we also have 15 prints by someone like Doc Thrash, who was an African-American artist in Philadelphia working sort of in the same period? And I think that those are the sorts of questions that can really complicate how we define equity, because it's not just representation in the collection, but it's actually thinking about the number of artworks that you have by major artists and trying to, I think, create equity in that way when you're collecting, if that makes sense.
So Marina and Michael both sort of led into one of my next questions, which has to do with what does equity or diversification look like to you? And I think they've both touched on it, but I'd love to hear what you have to say, Bindi and Janet, in that direction.
I mean, I think equity means a lot of different things. I think when we're thinking about who's in, Autograph's collection, and we're thinking about how we're commissioning another artist, at varying stages of their career, we're also thinking about the value. So not in relation to, necessarily meeting certain diversity targets, but it's more, what is the value that they will hold in the collection? Then what does that mean for them at that stage in their practice? And what does it mean for future, loans that we then generate to other institutions to show this work beyond, our space as well? And so, Mark Seeley, the director at Autograph, we often talk about this a lot. It's like, what is the value? And it's the cultural value is so much greater sometimes than the actual, monetary value. And someone, that is maybe only produced a very small body of work like Maxine Walker, she still has, a huge significance in the canon of photography in terms of British photography and the recognition of that work that she did, or, someone like Rotimi Fani-Kayode, who only practiced for a very short time before he passed away in 1989. And, 30, 35 years later, the legacy of what he's left, as a practitioner is still reverberating, through the way in which people consider someone who was born in Nigeria but lived in the US but lived in London, and the precarity of being queer at that point for him and what that meant. And I think there's a lot of, more conversations to be had, I think, around how we think about how someone like Rotimi is represented then. His work is now, 30 years later being collected by institutions from us, which is really wonderful. But I'm always interested in this idea of, does it have to be someone that is necessarily like recognized in the canon? Or can it be someone, that we recognize the value of the work that they've contributed, and thinking about the narratives in that body of work and not maybe where they are in their career. And it's always I know it's a tricky balance in terms of wanting to feel like you're either, betting on an artist who's emerging at that point or on the cusp of doing something incredible with their career. But there's also those slightly more quieter works that actually also deserve the recognition because it addresses other gaps that collections might have. Like, I'm always conscious, whenever we're making shows or commissioning artists, it's that it's not just following trends that other institutions might be following, but it's thinking about more broadly how that work will have impact with us. So we recently commissioned a really wonderful American artist, C. Rose Smith, with PhotoFest in Houston, to produce a new chapter of the work talking back to power that she'd been making. And as a result, that work is now on show at Autograph, and we just opened her first solo show. So, it's trying to figure out that balance. And I know there's always these very intricate ways in which we're all navigating that space. But, I think equity means so much more than just having representations and numbers of works, for me at least.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bendy, and I want to just pick up on some of the things that you put forward and sort of think about it in our context. So I think one of the ways that we approach this is also thinking about like the way in which we put the works to work. So, being an academic art museum where part of really what underlies our collecting strategy has to think about how we are supporting and expanding upon the research or interests at the university, but also supporting teaching and learning in an interdisciplinary fashion. So I think in terms of the works that we are acquiring, but also how they are kind of put to work in that context. So like the exhibitions that we're developing out of the collection, the opportunity to what we're emphasizing. So for example, one of my colleagues who, Essie Ronco actually, who used to work at the Hood Museum, who works on the collection, organizes a Looking 101 exhibition and also a Black Collects exhibition that is usually based on our student acquisition. And then, so there might be a theme last year was around thinking around gender, and that student acquisition was at the center of it, but then bringing in other works from our collection that spoke to that theme. And some of them were recent acquisitions, some of them were older. So I think part of it too is like the visibility that we give to different aspects of the collection through the work that we do. And what we're emphasizing in terms of the public access and profile of the different kinds of work in our collections. And then I think the other point that you brought up, Bendy, that I think it was interesting and thinking to consider is about this idea of where people are at the stages in their career and when you're supporting artists, right? So they're artists who are very young in their careers that, have become part of the collection in recent years, like Derek Woods Morrow or Zakia Najiba Dumas O'Neill, who we feel very strongly about thinking about the ways in which we can support artists at different parts of their careers so that you're part of that work. You're doing part of that work of having them become part of the discussion in the canon, supporting them right at that stage. So like, what's the canon that we're building for the future as well? So those are just a couple of things that I wanted to add to all the other great points that my colleagues have already made.
Janet got a little ahead of me. I was actually going to ask you and Michael about kind of some of the differences, some of what is made possible as academic people curating in academic museums in those different ways that we use collections than civic museums.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and kind of build on what other folks have been saying. Um, I think that in some ways we might be a little bit more nimble than some civic museums. And we might be a little bit more open to, I would say, experimentation in some ways, right? And I think that at an academic museum, our primary audience is kind of our student body. So some of the collecting that we're doing, I think, is very much with the student body in mind, but also the faculty who are using our collection to really teach with it, right? Um, so for instance, since I've been at the Hood Museum in the past 3 years, our Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program has become very interested in doing kind of bringing more students to the museum. And we just don't have a lot of works in that collection, whether more historical works or more contemporary. So that's been one area of focus for me, is trying to actually learn more about that as someone who really wasn't trained in that area. And then also, giving our fellow Beatriz Yanez Martinez, who is very interested in building our collection that way, the opportunities to do so, which has been led in part by our Director of Curatorial Affairs, Jamie Powell. But you know, Beatriz coming in, researching, suggesting acquisitions, and then actually being given a budget to make acquisitions for the museum based on their personal interest is a really great way to not only help them sort of build their career, but also help us really think about the collection in a new way, or maybe a way that I wouldn't have been thinking about it before conversations with them.
I think it's quite interesting, the program. Sorry to jump in, because I think there's a rigor there that ends up happening that I think other institutions actually could really benefit from when you're thinking on a much kind of even plane for people who are at so many different points to even consider the process of what acquisition looks like. You know, the rigor that goes into considering why, what the gaps are, how that would then work with other pieces in the collection to have these kind of cross-cultural conversations as well. And I think it's quite, I think it's great. It's a really great initiative. Sorry to jump in.
Yeah, no, that's great. And to add, I think we have some of the sort of similar considerations in terms of thinking about teaching and learning with the collection, but also we think also about, again, how it's expanding and supporting research that's happening at the university. So for example, at Northwestern, we have a young but mighty Center for Native American Indigenous Research here. And actually part of our strategic priorities for our current strategic plan is like close collaboration with them. And so our collecting over the last 7 years has like focused on this sort of increase of buying works by contemporary Indigenous artists that are supporting teaching and learning, but also kind of resonate with research and also co-curricular activity at the institution. We are also other kinds of collections on campus. Bendy, you made this point thinking about sort of different kind of conversations. So for example, at Northwestern University, we're the home to the Herskovits Library, which is the largest Africana, sort of dedicated Africana collection like in the world. And so our head of curatorial affairs has a background as an Africanist. And one of the things that we've been leading is been like buying photography from practitioners on the continent. So she recently led acquisitions of work by the Malayan photographers, you know, Emmanuel Bakary Dow and Hamdia Traore, that are in dialogue with some of the like 19th and early 20th century photography that's in the Herskovits collection. There was also, I think, you know, I was thinking about Marina's comment about how in a large sort of encyclopedic institution where there are all of these different departments that are working put together and somewhat independently, how it can kind of be hard to have a shared vision. And I think one thing that's been a benefit at working at a place like the Block is that that commitment to diversity and equity is really a collective and shared commitment. So I'm the curator of modern contemporary art, but I have other curatorial colleagues, our curator of collections, our associate curator of collections, our academic curator, and our head of curatorial affairs. We all work very closely together in terms of like developing and writing a joint curatorial statement about what our collecting strategy is. And that's something that our leadership, the director of the institution is on board with, as well as the other units that do collecting, our student acquisition program, as well as our collecting council. So there's this kind of shared, right, vision and commitment and that's also like kind of looking back to that collecting statement. And so I think when you're at an institution like that, that there's that maybe more of an opportunity for that cross-departmental kind of dialogue and collaboration and commitment to a shared vision. Yeah.
And Marina, if I'm remembering correctly, you are also the inaugural person in your position. So what has that allowed you to bring in ways that the museum, maybe hadn't been considering for your department?
Yeah, thank you for all of these thoughtful comments, colleagues, and for that question, Alyssa. So I'm the inaugural curator, but the collection of Native American art at the MFA Boston actually started in the mid 1870s. So Native American art has been collected by the institution for a long time. We were founded in 1870. And I think it's also important just, as a practitioner in the field of Native American art, to just also say that work has been done before me. There were colleagues, particularly in the 80s, such as Jonathan Fairbanks, who are very interested in Native American art, and we're continuing to build and shepherd this collection. I now call myself a mini department because we have a NAGPRA fellow, wonderful NAGPRA fellow named Penske McCormick that does great work in terms of just ensuring NAGPRA compliance, which is something very important, particularly when you have an older collection, even if it is small relative to the institution. It's 1,000 works. So really what I've been working on, and I think it leads to collaborations. When I was talking about the many different departments at the museum, the Native American collection has always been housed across departments because of the different medias involved. I'm in the Art of the Americas, but there's a strong, robust number of works in the fashion, textiles, and jewelry department as well. And so I work with those colleagues. And one of my major collecting initiatives has been actually with the prints and drawings department. The show that you mentioned is one of two. The second one, Ancestors in Place, is now up until October 16th. And it's really celebrating a collecting initiative with my colleague Edward Staywell, where we've been able since 2022 to collect over 70 prints, which really increases the number of named artists that are in our collection, and also explores and celebrates the way that many Indigenous and Native American artists have been collaborating with print shops over the last few decades and also before. And previously, we had a number of works by Inuit artists that were kind of from a few, such as West Baffin Cooperative, places in Canada. And so these kind of opportunities to work cross-departmentally, I think, are very ingrained into the kind of collection that we have. But of course, you start out with understanding it. And as many institutions actually on the East Coast do, much of the collection is actually Southwest Native pottery from a number of pueblos, not all of the pueblos. And so I think that it's important in kind of thinking about diversifying to first understand what the collection that you have is, how it became that way. And, the collection, in Boston that is mainly composed of Southwest Native pottery demonstrates a lot of attitudes in the 19th and 20th century about what Native American art was, right? What was worthy of being collected, what was worthy of being sent and brought back from tourist trips that wealthy Bostonians and other people in the region brought back. So I think in a way, even though it's a relatively small collection, it's a bit of a microcosm into understanding gaps within Native American art. And then also in my position, it's been a way to kind of slowly but surely fill them. And in part, just responsibly understanding who are the artists in the region working now, what are the traditions that we haven't explored or that we needed to explore in greater detail, such as basket making. So we do have a number of baskets, but there's a wonderful traditions of basket making in the Northeast, in Northern New England and Southern New England. And so this is something that I've really been kind of focusing on, which in one way speaks to the kind of bulk of the collection, which is 19th century and mostly unnamed artists, unfortunately, but also then speaks to named artists who are continuing to work in these traditions. And it's important, I think, to continue collecting historical for the kind of institution that we are, particularly because it's important just to make sure audiences know that like Native art didn't exist historically and then just like start again, that these are ongoing ways of making that have kind of always existed or had existed in kind of fits and starts depending on particular communities' histories. So I feel like that's a very long-winded way of saying that there's many directions I think that are important to kind of understand and go in working with such a large institution. And collaboration is really core to any kind of work that I do. And I found really wonderful collaborators throughout the institution. And although we're not an academic institution, I've also taken a number of interns. I have one this summer who will be with me for half of the summer for personal reasons. But it's really important to kind of make sure that there are opportunities to learn within institutions, even if they're not a purely academic institution or tied to a specific academic institution.
And what you were saying about how long work has been collected at Boston, at MFA Boston, makes me think, Michael, that you acquired some beautiful contemporary pieces. That's not your primary area of research. And some of the things, the strategies you have for doing this type of work with pre-1950s, pre-1900 works. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. But I want to pick up on just what Marina was saying about collaboration, because I think we've all talked about that or hinted about that a little bit. And I think that here at the Hood, collaboration is really built into how we're approaching building the collection, especially with equity in mind. And this will answer your question a little bit too, Elisa, but I'm thinking about where contemporary art is not something that I'm very familiar with. It's not my background, but you and I worked together, for instance, to bring in Nick Cave into the collection because you had more knowledge about Cave's work, the connections of his work to various traditions, and technically it falls under my area, but it wasn't something that I was super familiar with, right? So we worked together to make that acquisition. We presented it together. We wrote the curatorial report together and all of that. And we've been, and then we put together a show with Jamie Powell that was on Nick Cave and Jeffrey Gibson here at the museum. So collaboration in that way, I think, is really built into how we're thinking about building the collection. We've recently actually set aside part of our acquisitions funds for collaborative acquisitions. So the Nick Cave and Jeffrey Gibson was kind of a let's try this, but now we have a dedicated fund for collaborative acquisitions that help really expand our collection in more equitable ways. But your specific question for me, I think, was more about sort of the more historic artworks that I am tasked with. And I think that some of the ways that I've collected in that area might be seen a little bit unorthodox compared to some other museums. So, we brought in a really wonderful watercolor and gouache maybe a year and a half ago by a Japanese American artist named Toshio Aoki, who was active primarily in California, but did travel across the United States in the late 19th century, and is really only represented in in very few museums. Not very many museums collect his work. And I think that that is something that will change. But that was a piece that was incredibly inexpensive, bought at an auction, not an auction house that anyone would even really know. Or Walter Williams, for instance, who was a little bit later, but it was a print that we actually purchased on eBay because this is an artist who was really popular and well known during his lifetime, and I think still is known primarily with people who study African American art. But we bought a print that, was part of a series that actually hung in the Lyndon B. Johnson White House, right? And this is one of those artists who over time just hasn't been given the recognition that they had even within their lifetime. So, most museums aren't going to do something like buy a print on eBay. And we went through all of the correct processes. We reached out to the person who was selling it and they sent it to us on approval. And we, went through everything that way. But I think that if, I was to tell other curators at larger museums that I was buying things on eBay, they would laugh in my face. But right, it was a really important work for our collection because it really, the work itself portrays a young African American girl outside in a landscape. And we put this print in an exhibition that was about relationship between art and the natural world. And we just didn't have works in our collection that were really positive portrayals of young Black children kind of just enjoying the landscape during this period of the 1950s, 60s. So that is sort of a long-winded way to say that I think some of the works that I look at and that I acquire are really, let's say, low dollar value. And I think that that can be challenging sometimes for colleagues who maybe are used to equating, really well-known artists with really high value. And then whenever I come in and say I'm going to spend, not a lot of money on something by an artist that they haven't really heard of, but then they see it and see how incredibly intricate and important that the work is. It helps, I think, move us forward as a group. Yeah, was that what you were looking for, Lisa? Sorry, I rambled a bit
That
there.
was part of it because I've also been really interested in the approaches that you're taking to look at like American silver and who possibly actually made it and how that changes that conversation. But something else, that you said there about, which I think is important to this idea of this type of collecting, is what's been valued. What's been valued, who's had the chance to value it, what someone goes looking after, because sometimes you just get canon reinforcement of we should spend our money because people recognize the name, and so it's going to give a certain cachet to our collection, which then reinforces the same people, being being in the collection again. Again, back to that report that I was reading, and one of the statistics was like, yes, African sales in African American art have really grown, and it was like $3.96 million at auction. But then if you took out the Basquiat's, it went down to like 1.3. Because this one artist so disproportionately alters the numbers. So maybe some of you could also speak to that, like bringing in things and getting people to recognize. You've already spoken a bit about getting donors and people who will give gifts to learn more about who else they might offer. But the ways that this historical lack of value has also created part of this problem, and what we're doing to address that.
I mean, I have a few thoughts about that because I think, as and sort of thinking about what are the possibilities in our role as curators and as like educational institutions. So even if you're not at a university, right? Like you're like the MFA still thought of as an educational institution. Like you think of and like we're like scholarship generating, right? Organizations. And you think about going to, and that the idea is that, you're developing original research. And I think part of that is not just like reworking the same well-known paths, right? But it is about looking into things like that haven't, known. Like one of our sort of pillars of our collecting strategy is like looking at underrepresented histories and practices, for example, right? So I think if we can kind of like reframe like that our work isn't to like legitimize what the market has dictated, but rather to continue to push ourselves to develop more robust art histories, then I think that's just kind of an orientation that just may help, right, in terms of thinking about what we're doing with the collections.
I think also to pick up on what Michael and Janet have said, there's something around there was a conversation I was having yesterday about how, emerging artists might feel when they're not represented by a gallery, for example, and then how does that change the work that we as curators have to do to find the right kind of fit for what we're looking for. So, Michael, although you're collecting strategies you might say are unorthodox, I would say they're quite radical because it's changing the way in which we're thinking about how something is valued, what that might look like, how that then has a ripple effect in terms of something else that might happen with an artist that might see that piece and how they might respond to it, which then might lead to, many years later seeing that work again and that kind of constant evolution of how we interpret something, how something is given value, what constitutes that value as well. It doesn't have to always be financial gain. And I think we're seeing, the breakdown of some of these figures that are published by reports like the one Alicia mentioned, but also, on Artsy as well, when they're, publishing their sales data and what that looks like. And you start actually boiling down those numbers, and those numbers are tiny fragments, but the overall picture seems to be spelling all these, great things that are happening. But actually, it's still, you can't equate it. It doesn't quite translate. And I think trying to do something more radical is maybe the way in which we should be thinking about that.
Yeah, I couldn't find the exact number in the report, but I remember one of the statistics was something to the effect of like there'd been a 400% increase in acquisitions of work by Black women artists, but then that turned out to be like 23 pieces of art. It's just there had been so little previously that to get to 23 pieces out of the like 31 museums that they talked to was a 400% increase in what had been acquired
The
previously.
data's skewed, yeah, and it doesn't make any sense. And people think that, collections are now balanced properly, but there are massive gaps as well. I was listening back. So I'm part of this residency program at the moment, and it's 20 British institutions that are involved in basically commissioning 20 artists to respond to their collection at a time when they're thinking about how they might decolonize, change their collection policy, what that might look like. And it was interesting that one collection in the north of England in particular, the representation of global majority artists is 370 works, but the representation of white British artists, 26,500 pieces. So even if they continue to collect to try and address that, they can't think of it in the same way. There has to be a slightly different structure that's put in place that's about quality, not quantity, and then changing that methodology of what we're used to, constantly having to evaluate what we're doing, reporting on what we're doing, and changing that balance because those structures can't be put in place. There's a lot of artists who are overlooked, not because they're not worthy of being in a collection, it's because of the precarity of their situations as well, which has meant that a lot of the work has been lost or possibly, misplaced and then rediscovered again. And it's all of these kind of things that cannot be quantified. And I think that's also quite important.
Yeah, I definitely think there's questions around quality and why something's considered quality, and how that leads to its recognition when there are things like precarity that are coming into play. One of the artists that Michael mentioned, a large portion of his work had been lost in a fire. And so when there is very little work to go out into the world, and it's like, oh, well, no one knows who this is, how that also generates it. I also want to think about, how the knowledge making that happens in our various institutions also helps with expanding what is then expected of our collections.
Could you maybe say a little bit more about what you mean so that not, yeah.
Sure. So like the
Yeah.
books that are being put out, the types of exhibitions, when we travel and give talks, all of those ways that, that people who are interested in doing this type of work are then using that for, art historical knowledge making that is going out into the world in various ways. and how we, bring those ideas of the importance of making these collections more fully representative, is part of what we put out there.
So I think that's such an interesting question. And because I haven't been at my institution for 4 years, but in this role for um, three in September. So I haven't had an opportunity, thankfully, because it would be very rushed to do a lot of publishing. But one article that you mentioned in my bio that's been quite important was a co-written piece with my colleague Leila Bermeo and former colleague Tess Lukey that has been used by a lot of Boston universities, hopefully beyond, but I know certainly in Boston, kind of talking about our aims for the Native American collection and really, as a kind of strategy document, but also speaking about our various works as, curative paintings, which Leila is a fellow, which Tess was, and for me as the inaugural associate curator of Native American art. But also when you're in an inaugural position, or really trying to do something different with the institution that is quite old or quite established. A lot of my work in knowledge making is also just kind of making the institution understand better what I do. So this is something that happens kind of more internally, but I found it's also wonderfully helpful in kind of creating these collaborations and creating opportunities across the museum. So I, in a more public-facing way, I'm often engaged with our Indigenous Peoples Day programming, which also does kind of then help because a lot of my colleagues will sometimes just go to a free holiday day and like see what's happening. But also I really try to work to get kind of the knowledge basis up for my colleagues. So I've given internal talks on, what is Native American art? What do we even mean by this term? How do we understand it? What's the history of it here? And I think that's been really helpful in, creating partnerships, creating collaborations, all these ideas of like equity and diversity, because I think we need to kind of start with an idea of some shared goals, and a shared language of what that means. So just understanding that like Native American art for the US government has a legal definition, and there are laws that govern Native American art. Um, Art itself, but then also the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which I mentioned as NAGPRA, but for those who don't know, it's a 1990 law that was recently updated and really is a way for institutions to respectfully care for and return items that should never have been collected much of the time. So I think, knowledge building externally is, of course, very important, and it's wonderful to be able to participate in forums like this to speak about my work, and to have opportunities to publish in different ways. But I think also just regardless of the size of institution, it's important to kind of share an understanding. So if it's smaller, these conversations can happen quite informally. And if it's a large institution like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, I really find, some of my key stakeholders are like my colleagues who maybe don't understand why, you know, this collection has been here for so long, why it didn't have, a particular curator overseeing it, and why it's important now. I hope that most of them think it's important now. I feel like they do, but a lot of that just comes from kind of the work that we have to do internally to make what we're doing and why really understood, and speaking about things like ethical stewardship, because when I'm building the collection, I'm not just thinking about how it's growing, but also, how we are really caring for what we have, which is such a crucial part of being a curator of Native American art.
I think, well, gosh, Marie, there was two parts that when you started talking about kind of internal, it put me on a whole other tangent. But the first thing that I was going to say was, one of the things that we do at the blog, one of the kind of pillars of our collection strategies are thinking about collecting work that's legacies of our exhibition projects, so that the collection work and the exhibition kind of work and the knowledge building are kind of have like an intersecting point. So for example, an exhibition I did years ago called If You Remember, I'll Remember, One of the first contemporary works by Indigenous artists that we collected was featured in that exhibition. It was by an artist named Shamgar Shorn, who's no longer with us. And like more recently, with the exhibition, The Site of Struggle, American Art Against Anti-Black Violence that Elisa worked with me on, that we out of that work, we were able to bring into the collection work by Molly J. Vaughn, by Ken Gonzalez Day, also by Colin Karen Pope. And so it was like both then that you have a legacy of the exhibition, which we foregrounded teaching and learning with the exhibition, but then now there's this legacy with the works that come in the collection that can continue to do that work in perpetuity, but also thinking about how those there were books that were associated with each of those and how it started to form like scholarship, right, and what context in which those works can be placed, right, and can think about the value that is ascribed through the works, through the context of the exhibition, the scholarship generated. And sorry, I've got someone's calling. I needed everything else except for the actual phone, because who calls on the landline anymore? And the other, also too, in thinking about, like you said, sometimes you're collecting work of artists that are maybe more well known, but then also that you're collecting work by artists who are either emerging or who haven't had the same kind of visibility, and how like the exhibitions kind of create a context for them, and then you're like acquiring that work so that you're continuing that work of supporting scholarship around their work, engagement with it through teaching and learning, but then also that ongoing visibility. So that's just one strategy that we've used. Yeah.
There was something interesting Marina said about language as well that I think becomes quite important. I think we're in an era where the language that we're using is constantly changing. The context around some of these works is constantly changing. And I think there's the fluidity there of understanding something that may have been acquired 30 years ago and how it might have changed in terms of the knowledge that we've now got, and the scholarship that has changed maybe, and how that then might change the way in which we're seeing an object or an artwork, and what that then means to a different community when there is more knowledge that's there. There's not, Joy Gregory made a film in, I think it was about 10 years or so ago, and she went to look at a language in South Africa, and she realized, like, according to like the World Language Database, this language was non-existent, but she managed to find 20 people that still speak this language, and made a point of making a work in relation to that, to making sure that the legacy of how words are used, how communities speak to each other, is also acknowledged and remembered. And I think that also becomes quite important across all of the work that we do, because long after we've left these positions, what is the legacy that's left behind in terms of how that work was bought, why it was bought. And I think, thinking about that in relation to the shows that we then make it becomes really crucial, in that space of thinking about equity and value across even the work that we do behind the scenes in order to make these public collections as well.
I think something that you said there was so incredibly important, which is how this is going to continue beyond those of us that hold these positions now. How we make sure that it becomes so deeply embedded in our institutions, that becomes possible. And Marina, what you said about sharing your learning, your knowledge with your staff, your fellow staff members, that's also part of it. So if anyone wants to speak to kind of hopes, fears, dreams, for this work continuing on to not be sort of lost when this moment passes.
I'll jump in and maybe not quite answer that, but maybe hopefully get us going in that direction. But something that my other three panelists, I think, just kind of talked about a little bit was the relationship between collecting and exhibitions. And I think here at the Hood, for instance, if we take a large traveling exhibition that we did not organize, at least kind of in my area, and I think Elisa, you would say this too for yours, we try to make sure that we are collecting artists who were represented in that exhibition also. So, for instance, a few years ago, we took a large traveling exhibition from the Smithsonian American Art Museum called Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to Now. And while that exhibition was up, uh, myself and Beatriz Yanes Martinez, who I mentioned earlier, we actually went through and looked at the 126 prints. I think it was 126 prints that were in that exhibition, and started having conversations with artists who were in that show about adding their work to the collection because we felt that this was a moment in time where we had this exhibition on view at the museum, and how can we continue that into the future? And one way to do that is to actually then make a dedication not to just taking large traveling exhibitions, but then making sure that we are kind of holding ourselves to the reasons why we wanted those exhibitions by bringing those artists into the collection. So I think that that's one way that I think about, how this will sort of continue here at the Hood in the future. I think another way is just sort of the knowledge sharing that Marina spoke about, and then also the collections plans that we work on as a group, right? That I think Janet's talked about as well. Those are one way that kind of in a short term, right? Uh, we can ensure that what we're doing will continue on in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that um, as Marina sort of stated, and Michael and others said, that commitment and the understanding doesn't just like lie with one individual, right? So that maybe you're in that position of sort of initiating things or advocating for it, but how through those conversations and like internal education does that commitment spread to other colleagues, so it's not just housed in one place, but then also, as we alluded to, how does that commitment then become institutionalized through things like the strategic plan, the strategic priorities, the collecting statement, so these things that go on. I mean, in truth, there's like and then that starts to change the collection, and then hopefully whoever's coming after is then looking about, okay, well, this is what the collection is now, how do we build upon that, right? So I mean, the truth is that there's no way to guarantee 100 years in the future that this is what's going to happen. Just like 100 years ago, I'm sure the curators didn't think that we would be doing what we're doing now, right? In our institutions, or even if your institution didn't exist, right? But as curators, that the field be going that way. But I think like those sort of things of like kind of through like internal education, as Marina said, spreading that commitment and then institutionalizing it through those various mechanisms, right? Or like our best efforts at that. Yeah.
I'll also just add that I think that there's still a lot of work to be done on that front for me particularly, and I think for all of us, because I'm soon to be going on leave, and there's just a lot of things that I do, a lot of kind of outreach activities that it's still like an open question of who exactly is kind of taking those things on. Because again, I think it's part of responsible curating, but I think especially for a Native American art curator, I I think of engagement with Native communities as like so integral to the work that I do, regardless of if it kind of comes or merges or turns into a specific exhibition project or an acquisition. It's really just about kind of like understanding the community around my institution and kind of who in the city, um, and building, reciprocal relationships with individuals and with groups. And I'm still kind of in the processes of figuring out like exactly how to continue that on, even if I'm just gone for a short time. So this is, I think, something that, responsibly diversifying the collection, but also just, thinking about the museum differently in terms of what a museum does and what its role is and how it relates to the community is really the work of the entire institution. So it's, of course, collection building is very important to that, but it's kind of not the only step. And the work that we're all doing here that we are going to be continuing to do, So I think I'm still open to like other ideas about how to make sure that engagement is part of the work and how to, spread the knowledge that we're creating throughout the institution, the commitments that we're making. But it's like ongoing work that will continue long beyond me, hopefully, but also exists within kind of many colleagues right now and hopefully more in the future.
That leads to something I was thinking more in terms of the work that is done at Autograph with Bindi, but great example there about communities and community engagement and how that community engagement also tends to evolve who the audiences are at our institutions, and that audience growth then supports some of this work that we're trying to do, because then people are coming and going, oh, thank you for, having something that is of particular interest to my community. And I would like to, come back and bring people and see things without having to come back 20 years from now. That, it could be a more continuous cycle. And Autograph does such amazing community work. It's so integral to kind of how the institution was founded. So if you could speak to that, and then I know Janet and Michael, like you guys are also involved in engagement work in different ways.
I mean, I think there's something interesting about a lot of what has just come up, because I think we're all acknowledging the fact that a lot of the change that we want to see happen and maintain going forward for future generations is systemic. That change takes time, and I think all we are is like small pieces in that process of making things happen. I mean, what's interesting about Autograph, and I think Alicia, you touched on this, is the fact that although we are an organization that's 35 years old, we're not, we're considered a little baby in relation to the MFA in Boston and the Hood Museum as well. But it's interesting because we didn't have a building. So we were founded in 1988, but we only got our building, and that was purpose built in 2007. So we operated for a large proportion of our history as a almost a kind of agency style institution where collaboration and partnership and relationships was so integral in that process, constantly moving between thinking about how agile as an institution we might be, which meant that we worked with and continue to work with a lot of communities and different communities depending on what their needs are. We do a lot of education programs with special educational needs groups and families, and that is also important. So although in a session every month we might only be able to accommodate 3 or 4 families, but the kind of value of that for those families can't be measured in the sense of footfall coming into the gallery. And a lot of what we're doing beyond education is also thinking about refugee groups that we work with, organizations in the UK like Mouth That Roars and Women for Refugee Women. They're all doing such incredible work, and what we're trying to do is use visual arts as a way of amplifying some of those ways in which they're trying to tell stories and think about what that might look like for them. And so we're thinking about community in a very different way. I think we're quite unique in that sense of how we've grown as an organization over that period of over 3 decades. And I think it's also quite interesting to think about now where we are and also where we have gaps. There's a lot of work on that we haven't done with, say, the Vietnamese community, which is in our neighborhood, and that's something that we're actively thinking about how we address that, and building a program for 2 years' time that will be a show, but thinking about maybe what that looks like now, to build up that community engagement, because you can't just fly post and sit there and say, oh, we've done a show on Vietnamese artists. It's, that's not the right approach, but it's thinking in a very genuine way about how we can then retain that audience and what that looks like for them, what they might wish to see in our institution, and then thinking about how we then share that with other institutions as well. And so, partnership, loans, touring, exhibitions are all part of that for us, of being able to then share that knowledge that we've accumulated with another institution that might be able to add to it as well, and think about it like that it's evolving kind of pool of knowledge and people that come together, and what can be added to it to make it richer and more valuable in that sense for a community.
I think this question of community, I think one sort of like what you mean by equity, what you mean diversity, I think like trying to develop that the definitions of what you mean by community or communities, I think is something that is an open question that we're grappling with, and I think a lot of institutions are grappling with, right? Um, and also related to this is this question of capacity. So, at the obviously as an academic museum, there's like a particular kind of community that we're focused on in terms of students and faculty and the university and different units within that. And there are particular commitments in terms of our collecting practices and our exhibition that have and also sort of our areas of like research and intellectual commitment that have generated right connections to particular things. So like with A Site of Struggle, thinking specifically about the African American community in Evanston and those who've engaged with work around social justice in Evanston and the larger Chicago area, for example, that we kind of help to define. But I find one of the other and this also makes me think too about like Marina's question is this idea of capacity, because there with any, I think, institution, there are kind of multiple sets of communities that you could be serving. But what can you do and do well and stick with? I think based upon your human resources with the institution, I think is always this question. And I think it's something that we're grappling with. And so thinking about, the university community, but then our sort of Evanston and larger Chicago communities, and then how much of that can we actually engage with responsibly, and like sometimes having to think about sort of like depth and quality versus quantity in order to like do that responsibly and ethically. So I think that's something to think about, kind of being able to align your capacity and commitment to the particular communities that you that seem to kind of resonate with the work that the institution is doing and hopes to do.
I think it's an interesting point. And I think we can all strive for that. I guess for us over the years, what's been really precarious is our funding situation, which has meant that we have often have had to, try and, build programs that are just, massive in scale. But in order to secure the funding, in order to do the actual work that we want to do. And so, this last financial funding round that we got from our kind of central government is the first time in, I think it's 7 or 8 years that we had an uplift in funding, but that uplift isn't extra money. It's just money that's addressing the gap that's been there for, the last decade and a half, and being able to then, pay colleagues properly and acknowledge that we need that time and that space. But it's one of those ones where it's like the whole organization is in this stage of shifting that balance and thinking about exactly that question, how we do less and do better, but equally, trying to change an institutional mindset is also very, very tricky as well. And I think capacity is definitely key. I mean, there's only 9 of us at Autograph, and that's across the entire institution. So we're tiny, in comparison to bigger institutions and museums. And sometimes that slight dial shift of turning down is like almost feels like we put the brakes on something. And I think it's one of those ones where we're trying to unlearn a little bit of that behavior, but equally like not completely taking our foot off the gas and trying to work with a lot of the communities where we've built those relationships as well, to make sure that we are still their touch point when they need us as well. Because there's, one of the things I've noticed is that sometimes when educational programs, for example, take place, and the value of that for those that participate in those is so great. And then when it stops because, the period of time, 8 weeks, 16 weeks, or a semester finishes, and then they don't have that sense of contact, that there's a gap in the network. And I think that's also, how do we then maintain those relationships, and what does that look like? And that also then takes another level of energy and labor and time as well. So it's this kind of slightly vicious circle that we end up in as well.
Okay, I'm going to actually go ahead and open up Q&A a little bit early, mostly because I see some people are dropping off as the lunch hour ends. So people who do want to ask questions, I want to give them a chance to do that. I've also been asked by our event staff, those of you who are in attendance, even if you don't have a question, if you could please drop in where you're located, so that we get an idea of who attended this program, that would be really helpful to us, and we'd appreciate it. And then for those who do have questions, please either, put something in the chat or go ahead and use the raise hand feature. We're getting some responses of where you are. Well, while they take a moment to think up their questions, is there anything for the panelists that you don't feel we addressed, or that you would like to bring to the fore around this issue? Well, we have a couple minutes left. Everyone's out.
Go ahead, Marina. I think you.
Oh, well, I was just going to kind of ask, and I think Michael touched on this a bit too, but it seems like a lot of the collecting focus and the conversation and some of the questions have been around living artists. So I also just wanted to maybe ask if there's also, if we're thinking about, and I'm sure the answer is generally yes, but examples of kind of earlier generations of artists or artists who are no longer living that are kind of helping build this. And then I guess because I'm a little bit less familiar with autograph, and it sounds like you're doing very exciting work and wonderful work. If the kind of, for Bindi, if it's purely about collecting living artists, and then kind of beyond that, like I'm thinking about diversifying with historical artists. So I'm also just interested in that question overall.
Do you want to go first, Michael?
Um, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I think that in many ways, I think the way that I'm thinking about expanding the historic collection is with an eye towards diversifying it, and however that is actually defined. And I think that doing that sort of work can be difficult sometimes to message, and I think especially towards some of our donors. Uh, we have one donor in particular who's very excited about 19th century women artists. So, she's someone that I can go to and we can talk, and someone who will sort of support me as I'm working in that direction, for instance. But whenever you're bringing in artists who oftentimes aren't well known, or and I think Marina, maybe you faced this as well, well known within, let's say, the canon of art history, right, as it exists. And the dollar amount is lower. It's maybe seen as less prestigious for the institution by some folks. And I think that I'm talking about kind of maybe sometimes people within an institution, but oftentimes sort of those donors outside of an institution who are looking for those big names that they recognize, right, whenever they come into the museum. So I think that sort of messaging around how to do that, and how to not only add to the collection, but then exhibit those artists in ways that put them in conversation, maybe with artists who are better known, can be a really helpful way to introduce audiences to these artists who were maybe overlooked during their lifetimes. So right now, for instance, in one of my exhibitions that's up Liquidity, we have an artwork that I brought into the collection by James Bolivar Needham, who was an African American artist active in Chicago in the late 1890s who hasn't been collected by a lot of institutions. Um, and I was able to add his work to the collection, and it's this beautiful sort of impressionistic river scene. And I think in many ways he's kind of obscuring the pollution of the Chicago River in the 1890s. And I've displayed it next to a painting by a better known white artist named William Lewis Sontag that shows pollution on the East River in New York in the 1870s. So we have these artists who kind of are approaching this idea of, let's say, environmental pollution in the 19th century through their own sort of artistic lens of that time period. And whenever you put them in conversation, I think it not only elevates one artist, but it elevates both of them. And it lets you then get into a topic that maybe is more relevant to today's audiences who maybe haven't thought about what does environmental pollution look like in the 19th century. And here's two works on view in our gallery that really speak to that and how artists are thinking through portraying that in one way or another. So I think that thinking, and I think both Janet and you, and I think even Bindi said this earlier about how you add to the collection, but then how you're also exhibiting these artists and interpreting them within your exhibition spaces is really important.
And just to add to that, so for context, the Block Museum, our historic works are a very small portion of our collection. So traditionally we've collected works on paper, so prints, drawings, photographs, and we collect painting, new media on a case-by-case basis, sculpture on a case-by-case basis. And so we do have some like 16th and 17th century prints and drawings in our collection, but the collection is primarily 20th century. But within that, it is something that has been in our minds, and something particularly our Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs has been really interested in supporting, is thinking about more global kind of modernisms, like within that period. So not just the kind of like the US story, but like diversity within the US story, but then also thinking about that. And we've used the opportunity of, like traveling exhibitions, for example, like you talked a little bit about this, Michael. So we had a exhibition, Pop America, that came here from Duke several years ago, and that was focusing on kind of 20th century Latin American art. And like through the knowledge that was gained through that exhibition, we were able to acquire some, works that were like of that time period from different Latin American countries. A colleague of mine worked on that. But our commitment, I think it's been more on a case by case basis, where I think just in terms of our acquisitions by purchase, it's been more focused on the latter half of the 20th into the 21st century. But it is something that we think about and take seriously, and are wanting to continue to work toward. Yeah.
And we, oh,
Oh, sorry, I was just going to answer Marina's question. I mean, with Autograph, because we're predominantly a making organization, we tend to work with artists to produce work, commission them to make work that then evolves the collection in that sense. So it's very contemporary. But there have been research projects that colleagues Mark and Renee have done called, the Black Chronicles Missing Chapter Project, where they spent over 3 years in the Getty archives trying to ascertain Black presences in British archives, and then began a whole project around unearthing these stories of who these men and women were from 125 years ago. And as a result, the collection then kind of expanded when they started acquiring carte de visites as well. So there's a chapter of the story in the collection that goes back to 1870. And then you have like the most recent thing that has just been accessioned, last month. So there's a really kind of interesting moment in the collection where it turns, depending on what the research is. That particular research project, The Missing Chapter, was then used 2 or 3 years later from when it was inaugurated to then commission artists to respond to that. So then we had a moment at which the contemporary kind of collides with that historical information and research that's been gathered and then is used by artists to think about how they might make something in response. So it's very different in that sense because we're not actively buying work in the traditional sense. We're working with artists to think about what that means to them to produce something that's then accessioned into our collection.
So we have received a question, and they would like to know more about the 20 institution-wide collaboration around decolonizing collections, and what the US might learn from that project.
It's a really interesting project. So the 2020 is what the project's called. It's been led by the University of the Arts London through their Decolonizing Arts Institute. And in a slight role reversal, I'm the artist in this instance on that project. So I'm working with an institution in Northern Ireland. But I think what the project came about at that time of 2020, when I think globally we all witnessed a lot of I guess promise of change or considerations of change and what change might look like as a kind of catalyst for thinking about how artists of color have been so underrepresented within institutions in terms of their collections, and thinking about how an emerging artist of color or someone who's mid-career or considered mid-career might benefit from a program like this. So it's been a 3-year program that has had 20 artists working with 20 different institutions, and all in different mediums. So some have been film-based artists, some have been performance artists, some have been drawers, painters, etc. And it's thinking about what that interaction is like. So the residency that I've been doing is 15 months in total. And I think for me, it's the first time that there's been funding attached, like substantial funding attached to being able to make the work at the ambition that I would like to make the work, and having the support of the curator in the institution, but also the support of the UAL team to think about what making work looks like for me at this point. And, I'm now like literally 13 months in, so really towards the end. And it has been a game changer in terms of thinking about how far I've been able to push my work and what that looks like. And at the end, all the artists that have worked on the project, their work ends up in every single institution. So it's going straight from 0 to 20, in that very rapid sense of thinking about how their work will be seen, what that might look like, what that might feel like. And I think it's an overwhelming process, I think, as an artist, to consider that from not being represented or not feeling like you're being seen to then suddenly being in 20 national collections in your home country is amazing. And it's taken, I think, a lot of spearheading from UAL to really bring together the funding to be able to do that, to convince bodies of, like funder bodies or donors to think about what that actually looks like, because this isn't artists that are, again, equitable necessarily by recognition or value in that cultural sense. It's thinking about how you invest directly in the development of a new generation of artists who will benefit in the long term from this, and how they might build a network for them to be able to then, be able to approach institutions and have those conversations, what that might look like. So it's a really interesting one, and I'm happy to put a link into the chat for anyone who wants to read a bit more about the different institutions that come from it. And I think at the end in September, they'll be publishing 20 new pieces of commissioned writing that responds to each of the artists' work. And then a summary report will be published in due course as well.
Very exciting. Thank you for that question. We've basically come to about the end of our time. So if you could drop that link for us so we can grab that really quickly before we step out. And I would ask the panelists if you could stay on for a minute after this. But thank you so much to everyone who has taken the time to, listen to these wonderful speakers and taken this information and are doing this work at your own institutions. It's all really appreciated. And while it remains, an unseeable horizon, I hope we all keep looking in that direction. So thank you all for attending.